The first sign that something was wrong came with the silence. For years, Daniel Harper's lake had been full of life, rippling water, birds gliding across the surface, and neighbors quietly fishing along the wooden dock. But one morning the water looked strangely still. Daniel stood at the edge of the dock, staring at the lake he had protected for nearly 2 decades. Something had changed, and he was about to discover exactly why. But before this story ends, you'll understand the shocking truth the HOA didn't realize until it was far too late. Daniel owned a quiet piece of land just outside a growing neighborhood. Long before the houses appeared, the lake had been part of his property, an old natural reservoir surrounded by trees and open fields. When developers built the surrounding community, the Homeowners Association quickly formed strict rules, fishing restrictions, property limitations, usage guidelines. At first, Daniel ignored most of it. The lake had always been his responsibility, but recently, HOA President Linda Carver had grown increasingly frustrated with him. Residents kept asking for permission to fish, and Daniel allowed it. Linda didn't like that. She believed the lake should be controlled by the HOA, so she made it clear, if Daniel wouldn't follow HOA rules, she would find another way to stop people from using the lake. At the time, Daniel thought it was just another empty threat. He had no idea how far the HOA was about to go. And he definitely didn't know the decision they were about to make would affect the entire neighborhood. The argument started during a neighborhood meeting. Linda Carver stood at the front of the room with a stack of HOA papers in her hands. "The lake attracts too many visitors," she said firmly. "Fishing activity is becoming a liability issue." Several residents exchanged confused looks. Fishing had always been part of the community. Kids learned to cast their first lines there. Retired neighbors spent quiet mornings on the dock. But Linda had a different view. "If Mr. Harper refuses to cooperate," she continued, "the HOA will need to take protective measures." Daniel had attended the meeting quietly, sitting near the back of the room. When it was his turn to speak, he simply said something very clear. "The lake belongs to my property." A murmur spread across the room. Linda smiled politely. "That may be technically correct," she replied, "but the HOA must protect the community." Daniel didn't argue further. He simply left the meeting. Most residents assumed the disagreement would fade away like most HOA disputes. But Linda wasn't finished. Behind closed doors, the HOA board began discussing ways to stop fishing around the lake entirely. They believed if the lake couldn't be used, residents would stop visiting, and that idea led them to a decision that would soon create a much bigger problem. Because the HOA thought they were controlling a fishing spot, what they didn't realize was that the lake served a much more important role in the neighborhood. 3 days later, a truck arrived near the lakeshore. It was early morning, most residents were still asleep. 2 contractors stepped out carrying equipment in containers. Linda Carver watched from a distance as they walked toward the water. "Make sure it works quickly," she told them. The plan seemed simple. A treatment mixture would temporarily disrupt fish activity. No fish, no fishing. Problem solved. Within minutes, the containers were poured carefully into the lake. The water rippled slightly as the mixture spread across the surface. Then the truck drove away. For a few hours, everything seemed normal, but by afternoon, something felt different. Daniel noticed it first. The water looked cloudy. Birds that normally gathered near the shore had disappeared. He crouched beside the lake, studying the unusual color spreading through the water. Then he saw something that made his stomach drop, a small warning sign floating near the dock, "Water treatment applied." Daniel stood up slowly. He already suspected who was responsible, but what worried him wasn't the fishing. It was something much bigger, because the lake wasn't just a fishing spot, and the HOA had just introduced chemicals into something they clearly didn't understand. The consequences were already beginning to spread. Daniel walked straight to the HOA office that afternoon. Linda Carver looked surprised to see him. "I assume you saw the lake treatment notice," she said calmly. Daniel nodded slowly. "You authorized that?" Linda crossed her arms. "The board approved a preventative measure to stop fishing activity." Daniel took a long breath. "You should have talked to me first." Linda tilted her head. "Why?" Daniel looked directly at her. "Because that lake isn't just decorative water." Linda frowned. "What does that mean?" Daniel paused for a moment. Then he said something that immediately changed the mood in the room. "The lake feeds the neighborhood reservoir." Linda blinked. "The what?" Daniel continued quietly. "Half the community's irrigation system and emergency water supply flows through that lake." The silence in the room felt heavy. Linda laughed nervously. "That's not possible." Daniel pulled out a folded document from his bag, a property map. Pipelines were clearly marked running from the lake towards several underground storage tanks. Linda stared at the diagram. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she looked uncertain. But the worst part wasn't the map. it was the fact that the lake water had already been pumped into the system earlier that morning. And now the entire neighborhood supply was connected to whatever had been poured into the lake. News spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, residents gathered near the lake, whispering nervously. Some stared at the water, others looked toward the HOA office. Linda Carver arrived with 2 other board members. They hoped Daniel had misunderstood something, but when a local technician arrived to inspect the system, his expression told them everything. This lake feeds the reserve tanks, he confirmed. Linda felt her stomach sink. How much water has already been pumped? The technician checked the readings, thousands of gallons. A wave of concern moved through the crowd. Daniel remained calm. The treatment mixture may not be dangerous, he explained, but introducing anything into a shared supply without testing is a serious mistake. Linda suddenly realized the scale of what had happened. What started as a small HOA decision had now affected every home connected to the system. Emergency water testing teams were called, pumps were temporarily shut down, and residents waited anxiously for answers. But the most uncomfortable moment came when the technician asked a simple question: who authorized the chemical treatment? All eyes slowly turned toward Linda. For the first time since this conflict began, the HOA president looked completely speechless. The following morning, testing teams finished their analysis. Residents gathered once again near the lake. Daniel stood quietly beside the dock. Linda approached him slowly. What did they find? She asked. Daniel looked toward the technicians. They confirmed the mixture wasn't toxic. A wave of relief moved through the crowd, but Daniel continued, however. Linda froze. It still contaminated the reservoir system temporarily, he finished. The technicians explained that flushing the entire supply network would take days. The HOA would be responsible for the cleanup, equipment, water replacement, testing procedures. The total cost would be enormous. Linda felt the weight of the situation settle over her. All of it had started with one decision, one attempt to control something she didn't fully understand. Daniel didn't seem angry. If anything, he looked disappointed. The lake has supported this land for decades, he said quietly. It wasn't meant to be controlled. It was meant to be protected. Neighbors nodded. Some of them had lived here long enough to remember when the lake came first. The HOA came later, and now everyone understood something important. The lake wasn't just scenery, it was the heart of the entire community. But the final realization was still coming, and it would change how the HOA handled the lake forever. A week later, the lake looked peaceful again. The water was clear, birds returned to the shoreline, residents slowly resumed their morning walks around the dock, but something in the neighborhood had changed. During the next HOA meeting, Linda Carver stood quietly before the residents. Her voice was calmer than usual. The board will no longer attempt to control access to the lake, she announced. Instead, a new plan was introduced. A community partnership with Daniel to protect and maintain the water source. Fishing would remain allowed, environmental monitoring would be added, and the lake would officially be recognized as a protected natural resource. Daniel stood near the back of the room. Listening, the tension that once filled the community had slowly faded. Sometimes mistakes reveal things people forget, like the value of nature, or the importance of listening before taking action, and the lake that nearly caused a neighborhood crisis had quietly reminded everyone of that lesson. Because the HOA had tried to stop fishing, but in doing so, they nearly damaged the very water supply that kept the entire neighborhood running, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.